Is there such a thing as moral truth? Hi, I'm Mike Mason. This is the St. Joe Society podcast. The St. Joe Society is a Catholic lay apostolate devoted to help men order all things to Christ by growing strong in mind, body, and spirit. If you'd like to learn more about our work, you can see us online at stjosephsociety.org. All right, this is the Intro to Moral Theology, episode 4. We're wrapping up our first month. This first month is an intro to an intro. We're looking at some just basic fundamental principles of moral theology to give you guys 30,000 foot view of what we're doing before we start getting into the weeds of it for the next 5 months, which would be a lot of fun. So what I want to wrap up this month with is talk about what's called moral relativism. Okay. So I want to throw out the question, is there such a thing as moral truth itself, or is truth relative to each situation? Okay. So we're going to look at the question, is there such a thing as moral truth? I'll kind of narrow down what I mean by that. We're going to look at arguments for moral relativism and why I don't think they're tenable at all. And then we're going to get down into what I mean by moral truth being objective and absolute. Okay. So that's what we're going to drive at the end. So let's just jump in because we had a fair amount to cover and it's super interesting stuff. All right. Is there such a thing as moral truth? The question before us is moral truth objective and absolute? Okay. Or in other words, are there moral truths that are true for all people at all times and in every place? Or is morality relative to persons, places, or times? Okay. So the question is, are there moral rules? Okay. Maybe even if there's just a few of them that apply to everyone, everywhere, all the time. Or is morality constantly changing? Okay. Another way to put this question is, are moral laws prescriptive or are they descriptive? Okay. What do I mean by that? Morality is a science of prescriptive laws, which tells you what you should be doing. It's prescribing what you should be doing. It's not describing what you are doing. So when we see someone robbing a bank, morality is going to say he should not be doing that. It's not describing what he's actually doing. Okay, so the question is, are moral laws prescriptive, like what you should be doing or what you are doing? If they're prescriptive, then they have to come from something outside of you, which means that they'd be objective. If they're merely descriptive, they can change from time and place, if that makes sense. Okay. Lastly, before we launch in this, is our moral laws, is everything we're about to learn something we can just dismiss? Okay. So really what we're taking up the question is, if there's these moral laws that are true for everyone, everywhere, all the time, there's these true moral standards that are hovering above us that we have to live up to, then that really demands something of us. Okay. If it's relative, if everything I'm teaching you now is merely relative, it's just Mike's opinion, right? Or the Catholic Church's opinion or whatever, then really you're free to dismiss the whole thing. Well, we're going to try to get to the bottom of that. So we're going to look at what is moral relativism, why I don't think it works, why I don't think you should believe such a thing either. And then we'll look at what I mean by moral absolutism. All right. What in the world's relativism? All right. In philosophy, relativism is the view that there's no absolute truth or certitude about topics, okay, about certain topics. Okay, now when you get in the weeds of this, there's lots of different views on this. Okay, so some people will say truth is not relative about math and science things, but it is relative about religion and morality. Okay, so you'll find lots of variation in there. We're not getting that deep into it. What I just mean by relativism when it comes to truth is that it's the claim that that truth depends upon factors such as people, place, time, circumstances, stuff like that. Okay. So truth isn't something outside of us, objective and absolute. It's dependent upon relative or changing forces. Okay. That's relativism with truth. What moral relativism is, just piggybacks right off that. Moral relativism shows that there are no unchangeable principles of human behavior. None. Okay. So what's wrong for one generation is not necessarily wrong for the next one. So you'll hear people say things like, well, 250 years ago, they used to think this, but we now know it's that. Okay. Moral relativism says that not only some truths are like that, but that all of them are. Okay. This is key. So a moral relativist is going to say, well, people in the, slave owners in the past used to think that slavery was moral. Now we know it isn't. Okay, so was it moral, 500 years ago, but now it's not? Relativism argues that is the case. Okay, so relativism is going to say that morality is nothing but social conventions, customs, stuff like that. Okay, it's changing over time. All right, why do people think that moral relative? Why would someone think this is true? Okay, so most of you guys, imagine all of you guys have common sense. You're like, well, this is clearly false. Well, why would someone think this is true? They'll throw out a couple reasons like this. They'll say, well, moral values differ from culture to culture. Okay, well, I mean, that's sort of obvious, right? Some cultures value some things, some cultures value others. In America, we like baseball and football. In Europe, they think that's boring and they like soccer. So they say, well, they value soccer, we value baseball. Okay, well, those are different. They'll just say, listen, value is different from culture to culture so much. Morality is the same way. Second, they'll say something like individual people have different values. Guys like us value going to mass on Sunday mornings. There's lots of people who disagree with us. To each their own. Look, it's relative, right? You don't have to go to mass. There's no moral obligation to. It's just if you want to, great. If you don't, whatever. Okay. They'll say something like morality is determined by situations, right? So they'll say, well, in this situation, it's important that you tell the truth. But in another situation, it's important that you don't. So they'll say, if someone asks, if someone asks you a pretty straightforward question about what you think on a certain topic, you should tell the truth. So if your boss catches you coming to work late, he says, "Why are you late?" You're obligated to tell the truth. But if you're living in Germany in 1941 and you're hiding Anne Frank up in your attic, and the Nazis come around and they're like, "Hey, do you have Anne Frank up in the attic?" They'd say you're morally okay to lie because the situation changes. Yeah, they'll say something like that. Some guys say morality comes from evolution, so it's constantly evolving. Or they'll say, well, morality's moral relativism promotes tolerance because if no one's right, then we'll all just get along a lot better. Okay, so people say stuff like this. Now, what I could do, and I'm not going to do because it would take too long, is go through each one of those kind of arguments one at a time and show that they're ridiculous. Okay. Or at best, they have a grain of truth, but they missed the fundamental point. What I want to do instead is just kind of give more of a conversational response to someone who might make a claim like this if you ever meet them. Okay. What is a moral relativist saying? For a person to be a true moral relativist, they are saying there is no absolute objective moral laws that apply to everyone, everywhere, all the time. Okay. If that's true, okay, if it's true that morality is merely culturally conditioned or conditioned by custom or conditioned by person, then there's nothing to appeal out to outside of us to settle disputes. So I want to go through what are things that a moral relativist can't say. And then this will show you how ridiculous their position is. All right, first, a moral relativist, if they're a real moral relativist, they can't accuse people of wrongdoing. Okay, why? Because if you tell someone what they're doing is wrong, you're appealing to a standard outside of you that you think both of you are aware of, that they're violating. Well, they don't think there is a standard. So at best, a moral relativist can say, I don't like what you're doing, but they can't say it's wrong. That's ridiculous. That's you don't go to the Nazi Germany and say, well, I don't like the fact they're killing Jews, but I can't say it's wrong. That's ridiculous. Of course it's wrong, okay? Because the Nazis are violating a law, a moral law that's outside of us and them. Our opinion on it don't matter. Can't kill innocent people. Done. Okay. Second, and this is kind of accompanied this, relativists can't complain about the problem evil. They can't say, well, I don't believe in God because there's so much evil in the world. When you you say something is evil, you have to compare that thing to something. There has to be a standard of comparison. They don't believe there is a standard. So they can't accuse people of wrongdoing. They can't accuse people or complain about things being evil. They can't accept blame or accept praise. Why? Because if you say I should be praised for this moral act I did, for you to accept praise, there has to be a standard that you're living up to, that both you and the person giving praise acknowledge that you're living up to, or that you're falling short of and deserve blame. They don't accept that. They can't cry about things being fair or unjust. They can't improve their morality. Guys, to get better at something, there has to be a standard of achievement. So if you're trying to run the 100-meter dash really fast, there has to be a standard. Like I'm trying to run the 100-meter dash in 11 seconds flat. How do I know if I'm getting better? Well, 11 seconds flat is the goal. I'm at 12. Now I'm 11.9. I'm getting closer to the standard. And to improve morality, there has to be a standard that you're living up to. They deny there's a standard. When they say that moral relativism promotes tolerance, the exact opposite's true. Okay? If there is no moral standard, how are we going to settle disputes? If you and I sat down and let's say I have a position, let's say I'm pro-life and I sit down with someone who's pro-choice. Okay? If we both think there's an answer, there's actually an answer that's outside of us, then we will discuss with one another peacefully. We will tolerate each other's views because we think there's an answer and we can arrive at it. The moral relativist denies that. Fellas, if there is no answer to moral disputes, it's merely relative, then it can't be settled in the mind or in the intellect. It has to be settled in the will, which that's where you get violence. Because people if they're not going to settle their disputes with their mind, they're going to do it with their fist. Okay? Guys, moral relativism is untenable. You're rarely going to meet anyone who holds it consistently. Generally, what people are moral relativists, they generally are moral relativists only about certain topics. And most of those have to do with the 6th and 9th commandment. Okay? So one of the things when you're talking to someone who claims that morality is relative is just kind of throw out the fact that if it's truly relative, there's no standard. And if there's no standard, there's all these problems there, which I just kind of walk through a few. All right. I find most people are not consistent moral relativists. You just got to point out kind of where their inconsistencies are, and they'll start to back off. What do we think is the case? We are what's called moral absolutists. I got to qualify what I mean by this. I believe what I'm going to teach, Catholic Church teaches, is that there are moral truths that are absolute, which that means is they apply to everyone, everywhere, all the time. There are some moral truths that are objective. That means they're true for every person. They're eternal, true for all times, and they're universal, true for all places. Okay? For example, we would argue that it is immoral, absolutely immoral, to torture young children. That's immoral in every time, every place, all the time. Okay? Another good way to deal with moral relativists is just name a heinous sort of act and say, is that wrong for everyone, everywhere, all the time? They'll say yes. Go, there, you're not a relativist. Guys, there are some moral truths, okay, that are just hardwired into reality. Okay? Now, we'll get into this later. I'm not claiming that the list of these moral truths is super long. Okay. The 10 Commandments is kind of a good example of them, right? You have these fundamental moral principles. I'm not saying there's a ton of these things. And here's where the moral relativists, I'll give them a little bit of credit. When you take these absolute moral laws, you do have to apply them to the day-to-day life. So there is a subjective or relative aspect to morality, right? When you say thou shalt not lie, okay, I have to like, figure out, is this thing I'm about to say a lie or not? Thou shalt not steal. Is this an example of stealing? So there is like a subjective aspect to it, which we'll get into later. But the moral laws and principles themselves are objective and absolute. Okay. So think about like the most fundamental moral laws, the thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not lie, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods, stuff like that. Those are moral laws and principles that must be applied. What the relativist does is they only focus in on the application and they forget the law. Okay. We don't want to fall into that trap. So we do believe there are moral laws that are absolute. We also believe they have to be applied to our situation. And when you do both of these things together, you grow in wisdom and you understand what the nature of the good life is. So that's the basic gist. I think we'll lay off there. That was one of the heavier episodes. They won't all be quite that heavy, but hopefully you guys were able to track with that. Hopefully I did a good job explaining it. And if you have to rewind it and watch it again, definitely knock yourself out. But I'll have some notes and stuff for y'all to refer to help you out. So I think we'll stop there, and I hope you guys have a blessed week. And next month we're gonna start talking about what is the nature of the human person, which will be really exciting and cool stuff. So, all right, hope you guys have a blessed week. See you next time.